I'm from away, like most of us are now anyway, right? Well, everyone's from away at some point. And it's been an enlightening experience. The pandemic has been horrible in many ways, but it's also been great in other ways because some of us have stayed home and got on our computers and hit Ancestry and Jenny and all the other things out there to find stuff out. And I have always been fascinated about my family history because I'm adopted. And my birth mother was from Arkansas. My great-great-grandfather fought for the Confederacy for 2 years. He was 18 at the time. I don't think he was involved in the politics. I suspect there was a lady going, "Oh, Thomas, you've got to go fight for me and come back, and I'll be waiting for you." But I love that. I love finding out that you're connected to things that you have an interest in. I've been interested like the Civil War since I was a kid. I've been fascinated about the story of Lord Nelson, the British admiral. It turns out Westcott, who comes into the Whiting Tree down the way, was a frigate captain for Nelson and fought with him in the Battle of the Nile, was killed. So that's why I like Lord Nelson. And then I've been fascinated with Custer since I was a kid, and a guy by the name of James Porter, who's from Phillips, Maine, just up the road, died Little Bighorn. He's a distant cousin by marriage. He married a Whiting. I love that kind of making things I've read about as a kid, like, oh, my family members that were there.
Yeah.
And that's pretty amazing. And that's what happened with the Jonathan Whiting story. Now, my adoptive family is the Whitings. I've always been, I've been a Whiting since I was a kid. That's what I would have bell. My adoptive father's family's from Maine. They came in, his great-great-great-great-grandfather was a loyalist. A Confederacy on the blood side and a loyalist. Why can't I have that? And on the Ford, which is my birth family, related to Bob Ford, who killed Jesse James. Related to John Ford, who owned Ford's Theater. Oh, that's not good. It's not good. And on my mother's side, the Whitings and the Westcotts came into this country in the 1630s, and Stukely Westcott was the guy from Rhode Island. There's a name you don't name your kids anymore. Stukely. Stukely. His best friend was Benedict Arnold's great-great-grandfather. So Benedict Arnold, and he married Stukely Westcott's daughter, and so Benedict Arnold is my third cousin, 11 times removed. I've always been very proud of that fact, but again, a bad person from history. And through that, related to Stephen Douglas, another bad person. I'm related to the guy who debated Lincoln and the guy whose theater Lincoln was killed in. I love Lincoln. I can atone for that somehow. But the Whiting story has always been kind of an interesting part, and I have a dear cousin in Illinois who's done this stuff for years and years and years. He did genealogy when he had to write it down on a note card and store it in a file box.
Oh, cool.
That's how long he's been doing it. And he loves it, and he passed along, for me it was great because he passed along the family history stuff. Like I have a binder this thick of all the Whitings and stuff, and he passed that along. I didn't have to do the research. It's all right there. Thanks, Russ. But I've been more and more fascinated. We went last year. My wife's family has New England roots. And so last year, I was saying before, my poor 14-year-old kid has to go on family genealogy trips now. You know how much fun it is for a 14-year-old kid? Not much fun for my wife sometimes. But she has family in New England. So we spent last spring break in Taunton, Boston. Her 9 times great-grandfather was a minister named John Wilson. He was the first minister of the First Church in Boston. He was also the guy, Anne Hutchinson had 2 trials. She had a civil trial and a church trial. The civil trial was like, eh. The church trial, they said, see ya. Guess who the head judge was? John Wilson. And he's buried in the King's Chapel burying ground right in Boston, in a kind of almost an unmarked grave. They say he's in there somewhere. But I love this connecting the history stuff, and it just makes it more interesting. So we're on the trail of the Stanleys and the Whitings, and the Whitings started out in Dedham, Massachusetts. A friend of mine says, where's Dedham? And he always said, it's across the road from Norwood, you know, that part of Massachusetts. But it's amazing how you can write to someone and say, hey, I'm going to come through your town. I'm interested to learn about my family. Can you help? I wrote to the Old Village Cemetery folks in Dedham. They said, when are you coming? 3 weeks from now. Great, we'll meet you there. There were 2 guys with notepads and waiting to meet us and show us all the Whiting graves in Dedham. There are a lot of them in Dedham. That's where they started. And then they branched out into Rentham, Franklin, all that, which is where Amy's family comes from, too. Her family there is the Thayers. Sylvanus Thayer was the first real superintendent of West Point. There were 2 brothers, and the branches go like that. My kid thinks it's cool because Tommy Thayer, who's the lead guitarist for Kiss, is a distant cousin. Tried to get in to see the band last year, went and bang her. It didn't really fly. But, so the Whiting stuff, I got on the Whiting trails, I picked up this book, Whiting Genealogy, Nathaniel Whiting, Dedham, Mass, 1641, and 5 generations of his descendants. And there are books like this out there now that have been out of print forever. But people have taken them, rebound them, and they sell them because they deem to be of some historical value. You can find these on Amazon relatively easy, and they're not that expensive. And so I want to know more about Nathaniel Whiting and his connection to Dedham and who his family, who all these graves were that we were looking at. The picture that I sent Mary for the thing, I'm standing in front of a Whiting grave in Dedham. I'm like, okay, so let's looking through. Oh, look, there's a place names index in here. That's kind of fun. Where are these people? Where were they going to? We talked earlier, where did all these people move to? Why did they move out of New England? Where did they go? Okay, index of places. That's just Winthrop, Maine. I know that place. Like I was saying before, we go to church here. We go to St. Francis. We have come in here for baseball games. We have come in here to get the dogs and nails done. My kid insists on going to Subway once a week. Used to have one in Manchester, but they closed it. One that's right here in Winthrop. So we come here a lot. I was telling folks earlier, I brought my article last fall to Janet. She edited it, so I've been to her house and had a cup of coffee. And Winthrop's kind of a second home. It's, it's on the way to everything. We stop here all the time. Like I said, we go to church. There's a Whiting in Winthrop, Maine? Wow. So then you get, what's next? You go through the book. I go, what am I going to find? What's his name? Jonathan Whiting. There he is. Born in 1726. Wow. That's crazy. That's my cousin. And then, once you get that little hook, as you all know, once you get a little taste, it's like that first cupcake you had, right? You want to keep going. I couldn't stop. And with the pandemic, we were doing all the classes at senior college through Zoom then. Nobody's really going anywhere, so kids are remote, I'm remote, everybody's remote. 2 o'clock in the morning, I gotta stop because we get, you know how it is. Well, what's the connection? And then you read in there, then you go from there, you start Googling Jonathan Whiting. As we said before, part of the problem is, how many Jonathan Whitings are there? There's 50,000 of them. And how many Nathaniel Whitings are there? There's a lot of them. And sometimes in these families, they have a kid and they don't change, a kid will die, and they name the next kid the same kid. And they don't differentiate. And you gotta be looking like, Benedict Arnold's an example. His brother's name was Benedict Arnold. He died at age 2, they named him Benedict Arnold. They don't say Benedict the Third, it's just Benedict Arnold. So to be able to find where the line ends and where it goes and offshoots and everything. So Jonathan Whiting, who was this guy? You start Googling, there's a whole, some families have whole pages of, like, people have just amazing work they've done on their family history. That's how I found my birth mother. I wrote to the state of Washington where I was born years ago, and they'd opened up their records, and you could write and ask for the record, and they sent me a record, and it's, that's my mom's name. That's how I found out where she was from. And so you start Googling. There's a guy had a page of stuff about his family. He was related to the Fords, which is my birth name. And there's my mother's picture. I'd never seen her before. She died 10 years before I found her. But there she was, because someone's done a genealogy page for his family. Now, as you all know, you have to be careful with the genealogy stuff, because sometimes people get a little proprietary about their stuff, right? And nowadays you can really think, I know more than you do, which is nerve-wracking. You have to be careful what you do. Ask questions rather than assert things. Yeah. So Jonathan, okay, what's up? And one of these things said he was buried in the Metcalf Cemetery. Wow. I didn't know where that was at the time. All it took was a couple of clicks to find a grave. Wonderful place, right? Yeah. We just did that 2 weeks ago. We took friends down to Boston. I took them on a JFK tour of Boston. And the first place we stopped was in Walden, Massachusetts, at Holy Cross Cemetery. Big cemetery. JFK's grandfather's buried there. His college roommate's buried there. Guess who else is buried there? Tony Cannizzaro. If you're a Red Sox fan, but they don't, it's hard to find exactly where some cemeteries have great spots, you can find out where they are exactly. Well, you gotta drive around, but oftentimes the picture on Find a Grave, you go, okay, there's a tree right there. There it is. I was looking to find a grave of a guy who was on PT 109 with JFK. I finished updating a book I wrote about the executive officer of PT 109. He's buried in a little cemetery in Seabrook, New Hampshire. The picture, the grave standing up. Well, somehow in the last year or so it's fallen down. It's a military grave and it's fallen down. It's hard to find when it's lying flat on the ground. But again, that tree looks, okay, you just gotta look. If you love history and genealogy, you gotta look and keep looking. Don't get discouraged. Think outside the box sometimes to find where you want to go. So I drove over, where's the Metcalf Cemetery? It's right over there. Drove in there. Still trying to figure out what the hell Talleyrand was doing in Winthrop, Maine. There was an article in this book, this wonderful book, I've had a copy of for a long time. I picked up at John Merrill's bookshop. Talked about, they didn't like Talleyrand. He was an unsavory character. He was an interesting guy. I didn't know he was a cardinal in the Catholic Church. Interesting guy. But that's right there at that cemetery. I'm like, okay. And then I go, and there and behold, right there in the cemetery is the grave of Jonathan Whiting. There it is. He's got a Revolutionary War plaque there, indicating service in the Continental Army. Last year, we were lucky enough to be able to place a wreath for Wreaths Across America at his grave. But it's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, you have to know where the cemetery is to go find it, right? You have to look for a while to find, because oftentimes these old grave markers are hard to read. They really did get pretty close, but there he was. I went there this afternoon just to say hi. To go talk about your cousin John. Didn't hear anything, so I figured it was all right. So then I'm on to the trail. Who is this guy? What makes him unique? What's his role here? Right? Now, I'm not my understanding history of Winthrop is still growing. It's a fascinating town. I mean, it has to be if its first name was Pond Town. And like a lot of places, including in Massachusetts, they go, wait, how can we market ourselves better? Let's name it after the former governor. Winthrop, Mass, same deal, Winthrop. And there's all sorts of Winthrops that did the same thing, right? But Jonathan Whiting, you start digging and digging and digging, and more stuff comes out. You get to find out where he was born. He was born in Wrentham, Massachusetts, which is just down near the corner of Rhode Island and Massachusetts, where they kind of come together. Not too far from you Patriots fans from Foxborough. I'm a Vikings fan. Sorry, grew up in Minnesota. But it's just there, and Franklin is right next to it. Turns out it's where Amy's, the Thayers are from this part of the world too. And so then what do? You reach out, who can I reach out to Winthrop? Well, Wrentham has a historical society, and it's the usual same people that really care about their history. The sad thing is, there's an article in the paper last week about Brewer's Historical Society. They have a board of 11 members, only 2 serve right now. Because people younger than me don't care anymore. This is not exciting for them anymore. If it's not on technology, boring. I know, I have a 14-year-old. All right? So groups like this are starting literally to die out. And that's really unfortunate. I was glad to see you guys open up your museum. Hopefully that will help get some people interested in just figuring out where they're from, where their families come from, what their families did here. That's so important to understand where we're going forward, I think, as a people. So I found out Jonathan Whiting was born in Wrentham, Massachusetts in May of 1726. According to other records I found, he was well educated. And if you look through Wrentham's history, they had 11 schools that served over 200 people. It's a pretty small ratio of student to teacher, I think. I reminded that when I was in college, I went to a Bethel College in Minneapolis. I know Catholic, and I was the Baptist back in the day. And my advisor was a social studies, political scientist who'd served in the Air Force for 20 years, went to Harvard. And it was he and 6 of us in the class. He'd served in Libya for 20 years in the Air Force. And when we bombed Libya in '86, in retaliation for that strike at the discotheque, he could tell us all why we were doing this. Because there's 6 of us. It wasn't a class of 500. So I like to think of Jonathan having that kind of education too. If there's 200 kids in the area, and there's 11 schools, you do the math, that's a pretty good student to teacher ratio. So he's well educated. I'm still trying to find out if he's well educated. Did he go to some post-secondary, we call it? Did he go to Harvard for a while? I don't know. Records are still shoddy on that stuff, but I'm still trying to poke. And again, it's oftentimes what you have to do to kind of just, you get frustrated with it and think outside the box and go to the next place. And sometimes you'll be surprised what you find out. But we do know that he married his first wife, and they had a passel full of kids. That's a good colloquial term. Passel full of kids. And he came up to this part of the world, which was then still Massachusetts, right? As part of the Kennebec Proprietors. You've all read about this. Well, if you haven't read this book, it's hard to find, but if you can get a copy of this by Gordon Kershaw, the Kennebec Proprietors. This is an amazing tale of these guys whose economic vision outpaced a lot of people. Their names are still here. Bowdoin, Hollowell, couple of them were loyalists, right? But that's okay. But their idea was to harness the power of this river and the woods and all that the abundance that this place had, and they had to get people to come up here. Now, obviously, there were people here already, not just Native Americans. There were some Germans up here already. They had to kind of say, "Go away. This is our land now." I do love the maps of how they divided. Wouldn't this be nice if all our maps were just like that easy? Just a rectangle. That's your spot. Take your rectangle and be happy. But these guys are amazing because they have all of this insight and this willingness to share their capital and push on up here. So in reading about the history of Winthrop, there are different names that pop up in the early days of Winthrop that come out of, one of them is Mr. Scott. And they're trying to figure out, some people don't know exactly. He seems to have come from Rentham, which would explain why perhaps Jonathan Whiting decided to come up here. They were the same age. So if Scott's trying to get people to join the proprietors up here, he's getting guys from his town. Maybe something's played out in Rentham. Maybe there's nothing going on. The Whitings have been dead. They've moved south a little bit. Why do we move? New opportunity. Why did I move to Maine? I want to find a new job. Why did we move to Wyoming initially? Because that's where she's from. We had lived in Maine for 4. We go for economic opportunity and different opportunities and family and things like that. So that's probably why Jonathan Whiting came up here. I don't have any records of him sitting down with Mr. Scott saying, "Let's do this," but he showed up in 1770, 1771. He must have carried enough of a portfolio that when he gets here and they have early town meetings about stuff, he's nominated for a bunch of positions. It's like George Washington when he walks in the Continental Congress in his uniform. Doesn't say, "I want the job," but he sits in the corner like, "Who do I want the guy? Hey, that guy's got a uniform on. Let's have him be the general." So Jonathan Whiting comes here. He's the first treasurer. He's on the select board. Just all different things. Deacon of the church, justice of the peace. Something about this guy that people go, "Wow, this is the kind of guy we can rally behind. This is the kind of guy we can serve with. This is the kind of guy who we think has the best interest of the other people at heart. And let's tap his skills. Let's ask him to be part of it." And he does. He serves in all those positions right off the bat. Well, we all know what's happening in this time period, right? 1771, 1773, 1775. Things are not smooth here. It takes a while for news to get up here, what's going on in Boston and other places, but eventually it does get up here. People up here, like I said, the guys who ran the Kennebec Company, all those guys were loyalists because they got more money than they know what to do with. A little bit of taxes from the king doesn't bother them too much. I think the King's Act protected them. It's the lower folks down here, hardworking guys and gals, who are irritated by these tax problems. And as this part of the world erupts into that sort of thing, people start taking sides. Jonathan Whiting is one of those. He takes the side of the Patriot cause. Now, oddly enough, he's gone down to Rentham. His first wife has died. He's gone down to Rentham to see family. Maybe get some other affairs in order. He's got the kids coming up here. And he's in Rentham visiting when the revolution breaks out. Rentham's about, by now it's like a 45-minute drive on a good day to Boston. So I checked with the Rentham Historical Society. They don't think Rentham boys didn't get to Lexington and Concord in time, because that happened too quick. It was over in 24 hours. But there are records that showed Rentham boys went, and he's not a boy, he's in his 40s at this point, to Dorchester Heights. You don't know why St. Patrick's Day is a big day for a lot of us, but in Boston it's called Evacuation Day. It's the day the British left Boston. But before that, they had to fortify and bring the cannon that Henry Knox went to get from Fort Ticonderoga, that Benedict Arnold went up to beat down the first time and got that stuff figured out. But they fortified Dorchester Heights. And the British could wake up one morning and go, "Oh my God, what's going on here?" And they turned tail and ran. But Jonathan was there. His son, John, my son's named Jonathan, Jonathan. And there's Jonathan's family is Nathaniel, John, 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 Jonathan. Some folks here spell Jonathan, John, Nath, which is something different I'm not used to. But his son, John, here we go, 35 different Johns in the same family tree, joins one of the regiments from Coburn's group that goes with Arnold up to Quebec. And he died outside Quebec, probably froze to death, or malaria. A lot of those guys were sick on that expedition. And they're another family connection where the Whiting Westcott Arnold connection ties in with my connection with Jonathan Whiting. So Jonathan Whiting's son served with Benedict Arnold. Now I found out a couple years ago, one of the guys in the Whiting side is a guy named George Soule, came over on the Mayflower as an indentured servant, signed the compact. His son Zachariah married my Ford grandfather's daughter. So I called my brother one day and said, I got bad news for you. You thought you got away with it by being related to me by adoption for all these years? We're actually related by blood, but it's way back then. Oh, I could hear him just like, no, no. But that's one of the fun things. You know, New England, there aren't a lot of people here. During the witch trials, you could take everyone in New England and fit them inside Fenway Park. That's not a lot of people. Right? So, it's not surprising these people interconnect and meet each other and serve with each other. So it must have been horrifying for Jonathan to have served in Dorchester, come back up here, find out his son has died up before Quebec. I need to find out where John Whiting, if there's a record where he died, where he's buried, but we know he died before, on December 10th, which is before the assault on Quebec. Probably froze to death. Horrible. If you haven't read about Arnold's expedition, how any of those guys got out of there, I don't know. Unbelievable. So what is Jonathan supposed to do? Now he's back here, his son's dead. His wife is dead. So he can throw himself into the affairs of the community. He can turn and keep serving. He serves as justice of the peace. He's a deacon at the church. He gets involved in the committee of correspondence, which is, let's call that the colonial equivalent of the internet. It's the way they talk to each other. Paul Revere, the reason Paul Revere was selected to ride, because he was one of the committee of correspondence guys. He knew where all the roads were outside of Boston, how to get there quickly. They know these roads, they know the people, they know how to get places. Jonathan's part of that group, and he serves in the interim as the head of the part of the committee of correspondence. Well, people kind of forget when we talk about the Revolutionary War that it had all these great bursts of activity. Lexington, Concord, Boston, Saratoga. Then it kind of petered out for a while. Took a while to get the French come in. 1778, 1779 is kind of a quiet time. One of the things that I found out when we're doing research over the years is one of the reasons that Benedict Arnold decided to do what he did was because a lot of generals were thinking about this stuff. Well, what, you brought the French in here now? I thought we just got rid of a king. Are you going to bring in a Catholic king? Maybe the old Protestant king isn't so bad. I wish he hadn't done it, but other guys were talking about this stuff. Arnold's case is complicated. But the British have decided to kind of notice that people aren't doing much up in this part of the world. And so they decide they're going to set up a loyalist enclave up near where Castine is now. Call it New Ireland. If you've got New England, let's have New Ireland. And so that's what they intended to do in 1778, 1779. They sent troops in, and they would bring settlers in. And I would imagine that my Bell ancestors probably would have gone there if this had been successful, rather than Nova Scotia. The first Bell I know of was a guy named Thomas Bell, ironically my brother's name, fought for the Loyalists in Butler's Legion, fled like a lot of them did for Canada, met his wife, who never learned to read and write. On his will, she signed with an X. And they lived there until they came back into Maine and settled in Hodgson and Houlton area, and then moved down to Gardner, and then to Minnesota. But Jonathan is recruited to help defeat the British and their plans to establish New Ireland. The problem with it is you don't have a lot of young guys who can serve now. You got to go get the 40, 50-year-old guys and say, we need you to kind of group up and let's go. Okay, so Jonathan, probably at an age where he probably said, you know what, I don't need to do this now. I've done my fair share. I've lost a kid. I was at Dorchester. I've done this. But he does it. It's this citizen, this new idea of a citizen serving your community that Jonathan, I think, embraces. So you know the story of the Penobscot expedition? They go up and they try to dislodge the British, and there's this huge 2 or 3 weeks of indecision. Should we fight? No. Should we attack? No. It's all these, because there's no real chain of command. It's all state militia as opposed to Continental officers. There are some Continental Marines, but most of it's just a bunch of guys who, I have the fancier hat than you do. One that has to be Paul Revere, who's later brought up on charges of cowardice. Yes, the same man who rode through the night, but he's concerned enough about this that he fights it and gets it removed from his record. Ironically, his commanding officer is a guy named Peleg Wadsworth. well, that's another name, like Peleg, Stukely. We should have another, I'm gonna have Jonathan name his kids a name, either Peleg or Stukely. But Wadsworth's grandson is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And who puts Paul Revere on the map? Henry Wadsworth. It's a small world after all. Because Revere was forgotten to that point.
Right.
And I still think if they had written the poem, Listen, my children, and you shall be aware of the Revere rhymes with something. You can find a word that rhymes with Dawes or Prescott, because the two other guys, who one of them, Dawes didn't make it either. Revere didn't make it. He got stopped. Prescott's the only guy that made it. But he wasn't famous because it didn't rhyme with Listen, my children, and you shall be aware of Paul Revere. But it's funny that Revere becomes an icon in American history because his commanding officer's grandson wrote this poem about it. I don't know if he sat down in his dying breath and said, remember Paul Revere? I don't know. But I find it amazing that this 50-ish-year-old man was fighting, answered his call, took up the rifle, marched from here up to Castine area, which isn't an easy walk. That's a up and down and through the woods and over the hill. But he did it. And somehow he came out of it alive. And he came back to this town to be part of this thing that he saw. Now the war's drawing to a close, and now he wants to be part of, where's this going to go? What does this new country look like? How do we make things work? How do we all participate as citizens of this democracy? And remember, it took a while after the war was over for all that to be settled. The war wasn't over until 1783. People forget that. Yorktown, all done. No. Teetering and tottering back and forth to make sure this stuck. What is Jonathan Whiting doing during this time? He's serving in the Massachusetts General Court of Boston. Now, I've looked at a distant cousin applied for membership in the Sons of the American Revolution. He had to cert all the things that Jonathan Whiting did. And then there it says, member of the General Court. And you look into some of the memoirs and books, like Stackpole's book, it talks about General Court. I didn't know when. So what do? You write to the Massachusetts State Archives. You want to do research on your family in New England? Go to Boston. Take a week. Go to Boston. They will set you loose in there and give you stuff, and you'll be finding out that, it's amazing what you can find out, the records they have. And they wrote back and said, hey, he served 3 terms in the Massachusetts General Court. They couldn't find any record of any big issues. He didn't sponsor any legislation. Most legislators don't. But the fact that, again, he served his country, his new country. He's done it. He's lost family. He's probably lost money in doing this stuff. One of the things that Benedict Arnold never liked was he used his own money to outfit that trip to Quebec, and Congress never paid him back. He outfitted his own regiment. Congress didn't pay him back. That's not why he did it, but he's losing money over this. So did Washington. They all did. But that's not what this is about. It's supposed to be about serving in a cause other than yourself. So here's Jonathan Whiting. He's in his late 50s now, early 60s, and he's serving. And then he comes back home. He remarries Hannah Metcalf, who's a widow. Her husband was Dr. Metcalf, and settled down. And I imagine this is the time, the last 15 years of his life, where he's sitting on the front porch, telling stories to the kids that come by about Paul Revere, or about Dorchester Heights, or about people he knew that fought Lexington and Concord, how his son served with Benedict Arnold and didn't come home. Trying to instill in these kids another version of history, telling them from the cat's mouth, so to speak, what's really happened. So it's not written, and then you find it. Someone who actually there is telling them that story. And it gets written down. People remember this stuff. When he dies in 1807, I'd like to imagine him as a guy who Winthrop really mourns, because he is a founding father of this town. Can we say that today still? Founding mothers, they're both all over there. He was here when this town began. He's part of the legacy, I think, of this town. And so for me, being from away, being from Minnesota with some Maine connections, it was absolutely amazing to me to find this connection here in this town. How many times have we looked at a house, there's that house at the corner of, what road is it? It goes up to Reedfield. There's a big house, we looked at the house, we moved here, and knowing that half a mile down the road is the cemetery with my ancestor in it, was pretty amazing to me. And I think what it taught me is history can sometimes seem like it's in a book and it's like boring. That's why kids hate it. because it's like, what do you find out? You have connections to this stuff? And it's what I love the stories of just ordinary guys like Jonathan Whiting. I love being credited to Benedict Arnold, that's amazing. Or Stephen Douglas, or Bob Ford. These are fun stories. What I love, really an honor to people like Jonathan Whiting. His grave is probably never visited. Most people don't even know where Metcalf Cemetery is. And it's worn down. I went there today, make sure he was okay with all this stuff. Really look at that gravestone, it's really worn out, worn down. Hannah, his wife, is right next to me. Now I want to go back to Rentham and see if I can find out where his first wife is buried. But I find this stuff, it draws you in. And in a day and age, we're always talking about whose history is right and whose history is what, taking down things, statues, all this stuff we talk about. Just find out that your family member had a role in the establishing of a good, solid community. He didn't build the White House, he helped build Winthrop, Maine. And I go here all the time. That's what makes it really special for me. So that's kind of the story of Jonathan Whiting. I'm still looking and digging. But I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. If I don't know the answer, I will write it down. I'll go looking for it. Janet knows that about me, right, Janet?
Absolutely.
So there you go. So any questions? I would just encourage you, particularly those of you who have kids or grandkids around, now that we can move around a little bit, take them out. I know they're going, I want to go to... Take them to the grave of somebody in your family who did something. Even if they didn't do anything big, they were here. They saw this town get formed, or whatever place you want to go. Because it's amazing what people will do if you walk up and go, hey, I want to talk to you about so-and-so. Like, really? Okay. My wife did that. In Franklin, there's a school named after the Thayers, which is on her family side, and they've never had anybody from the family call before. They were going to tear the school down. I said, call them and ask them if you can have, there's a picture of the Thayer. Can you have that stuff? They never got back to it. I think they probably tossed it, but that stuff is sad when it's lost. I'm always sad. I love the fact that you all have done this here, because this is such a nice museum, and the stuff you have is a nice snapshot of what this town is, what it means to people. And I always feel bad when you go like to a antique store and there's photographs, daguerreotypes of someone who, I don't know, that's Bob.
Yeah, I want to take them home.
Yeah, and then do the research, right?
So bad.
And then do the research, because you're going to find, there was a great show on HBO a couple years ago called Family Tree. It was a comedy about a guy who wanted to find out about his great-grandfather. He thought he was a British Major General, because he's in this guy's in a uniform. Turns out he was, as the more and more he found out, the guy was not a Major General. He was acting in a theater, some Gilbert and Sullivan stuff, and at one point he was a pantomime horse. It was the back end of a pantomime horse. And then he comes to America and finds out his relative who was a double agent. And all, it's just, but it was, because it shows you how fun this can be, and how, I mean, it can be goofy. Like I said before, you gotta be careful sometimes. You get on the internet and you start going through ancestry stuff, and someone, well, that's not really what happened. I gave a talk once about Butch Cassidy, in character as Butch Cassidy. And one of the ladies fell asleep. Only one person showed up, and she fell asleep. I think she dated Butch back in the day. But when you go into that, you go a place where Butch Cassidy used to live, as Butch Cassidy, or I gave a talk in Keene, New Hampshire about Jonathan Daniels, who's the civil rights hero that I researched. My son's named after him. And the other guy that was killed, shot the day that Jonathan Daniels was shot and killed, was there. I was like, oh. And then Jonathan's first love, his first girlfriend was there. And she called my wife up, she said, it's like he knew him. So I like to make that history come alive. I like to sense that I can maybe knew Jonathan Whiting, that maybe there's some traits that come down in my family that are his. I look at there's a picture of the third Jonathan Whiting in the history of Winthrop. I hope Jonathan Whiting didn't look that serious. He was, but no one smiled back then, right? Even Lincoln barely cracked a smile that last picture, but he just didn't do that. So that's my story of Jonathan Whiting. It's not complete. I'd like to find out more. I just got to keep digging. The story's out there somewhere. I'm going to have to go down to Boston to the Genealogical Society and start really poking around. I'm sure there's some stuff in there that we don't know. But
Where did Hannah come from? The second wife?
Second wife, she's a Metcalf. So I don't exactly know where the Metcalfs came. They're big players in this part of town too, and I need to find out more where the Metcalfs. Maybe some of you can enlighten me where the Metcalfs came from. They have their own cemetery named after them. She's right next to Jonathan. I'd like to find out what happened to his first wife. I'm assuming she's buried in Rentham, but I hadn't made the connection when we were down there last fall. That was last spring. That was after I got home and started reading this book. My kid thinks I'm crazy. What are you doing, Dan? We did the genealogy stuff,
Yeah.
you know? And the Whiting, so Nathaniel Whiting, the first Nathaniel Whiting, they come from a long line of ministers in England. Giles Whiting was the first. He's, that way I reckon he was a minister. And there's a couple ministers, and then there's, like I said, there's Nathaniel and Timothy, and Nathaniel and Timothy and Calvin and Isaac. You gotta keep your eyes peeled where you're going. But the Whitings ended up in Minnesota, and my great-great-grandfather Whiting was a Civil War veteran. Was wounded at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in '64, lived the life of a farmer, and was gored to death by a bull on his farm. My mom never heard that before. What I love is discovering stuff. My mother totally freaked out last year because I found out that her grandfather, a guy named John Unger, was from Mechanicsville, Pennsylvania, right? Uh-oh.
She's from
And
there.
it was Unger?
Unger.
I knew Ungers.
Okay. This is crazy. We're talking afterwards. Moved out west to Montana, married my mother's grandmother.
Oh,
Right. But found out that he'd been married once
Do you want a more comfortable chair, or are you all set?
Look at, well, this,
Thanks for coming,
and I
Dave.
said to her, she was
Bye.
like, no, that didn't happen. I said, why do you say that? Well, he never told us about that. Well, and I suspected, and I went back and found out they were married. His first wife was probably 18, 19 years old, may have died in childbirth. Sometimes they didn't talk about that stuff. Theodore Roosevelt's first wife died in childbirth. He never spoke her name again. It was a Victorian thing to do. I said, Mom, how many John Anthony Ungers from Mechanicsville, Pennsylvania can there be? Born on the same day? No, there aren't two of them. Sorry. But again, these are things you kind of find out. And then Jonathan, my son loves to do, he takes German. There's some German blood in the family. He thinks that's really cool. And you can go find out where the family came from in Germany. Here's the weird thing though, I found out. I thought as a kid growing up, I was told I was very Irish. That my birth father was Irish. And I was like over 70% Irish. Well, that's pretty awesome. St. Patrick's Day has always been a thing. When you get an ancestry, start doing some digging around and do the swabs, I'm only 6% Irish. I said to John the weeks ago, happy St. Patrick's Day and that's it? No more celebrating. He's like, Dad, you are such an Irish Catholic, it's not even funny. You have to keep celebrating that way. Okay. But you'd be surprised. Sometimes you'd be prepared, we do this family history stuff, to find out stuff they didn't know.
Right.
And they can shock the hell out of you, pardon my French, right? But if you go in with an open mind and just can allow yourself to be wowed by what you're finding, it's really fun. And you find out stories that your cousin lived in the town next door over. When he first started out in Reedfield, his first plot of land was in Reedfield. I said, Jonathan, you go buy that every day on your way to school. This is, our family has roots here. Not enough to not be from away. I get it, I'm from away. But on both sides now, the Bells and the Whitings, people were here in our family beforehand. So I think it's absolutely amazing. So, any other questions?
So, Jonathan had children
Yes.
that,
Don't ask me to name them all, because
okay,
there's,
but they lived in the area?
yes, for a
In
long
Windsor?
time, yeah.
Were they active, like their father?
Yeah, Jonathan, yeah, in this book, which is a wonderful book, right, Jonathan Whiting is only mentioned once. He's not mentioned as one of the town founders, he's not mentioned, which I found was really odd. You have to look at other stuff. I downloaded that book, there's an archive copy at the state library, it's on my computer. Whew, that's a lot of RAM or whatever they call it nowadays. But Jonathan Whiting's in this book, and it talked about how he was very kind to his neighbors. And when everybody else, he had a nice farm, which we know he had money, that he was very judicious to his. There was a time when Jonathan Whiting had grain, several other families had none. Lest the neighbors might suffer, his wife put the children upon an allowance. He, to teach them to be economical in the use of their bread, would sell only a limited quantity to anyone, lest some others might be more needy. The soundness and strength of his moral principles were exhibited in another way. During this period approximating a famine, he might have paid almost any price for his grain, but he affixed a reasonable price, and no consideration could make him take any more. It doesn't say which Jonathan Whiting that is. That could be the grandson. And like I said, if you go through the history, there's a genealogical part of that book, and there's Whitings and Whitings and Whitings. And eventually, now this branch that was in Maine is not, my direct branch is the one that went to Minnesota. But they did stay here for a long time, and I think there are cousins still, I mean, there's a guy that called her, right, Mary, that a couple weeks ago, and I need to get a hold of him.
Yeah, was
Wants to
interested.
find out.
And Monica's, Mabel Whiting was here. She, that was her husband's name, but
So it's just amazing, and it's a name,
her
I didn't
kids.
think much of it until you find out that there's all these people in different parts of the country named Whiting, and it's all from the Fords are the same way. I've been to the marker in Marshfield, Massachusetts, where Deacon William Ford is the first Ford that came to the States. His family lived in Baltimore, which is where John Ford and Ford's Theater comes from. But then my 5 times great, this is where I found out my mother, my 5 times great grandfather was a guy named Lloyd Ford. He was a slave owner in Tennessee. When he died, he freed his slaves and gave his slaves half of the land he had. Well, the reason he gave the slaves land is because the kids of those slaves were his kids. Not an uncommon thing. And his white kids sued the estate and said, no. And that went on for 10 years. It broke. The white kids sued so many times they had no money, and then they moved to like Missouri and Arkansas. And you all know the Arkansas jokes, right? The family tree is a bit of a wreath. But just the next month they're unveiling a marker in this part of Tennessee because the judge said, no, these black children have every right to this land as much as the white kids do. They have souls, they have their people, which is at the same time of the Dred Scott decision, which occurred because of a slave that lived in Minnesota, and it was the exact opposite. No, they're just property.
Yeah.
So I can't countenance the fact that my grandfather I wasn't the slave owner, and he did free them when he died, and he did make an allowance for them to. I'm in touch with cousins in St. Louis, who are descended from the slave side of the family, and every couple of years they get together and have a reunion, and it's pretty wild to watch white folks and black folks get together and talk about their shared history. It doesn't have to be divisive, it can be something that brings us together. And so, again, there's, my poor mother, like I said, she passed away about 10 years before I found the family. Hard life, living in Arkansas, it wasn't easy. But again, I didn't live that life. I can talk about her and share things, same thing with anybody. So, if you have family members that are interested in this stuff, by all means encourage it, because like we said, some of these groups are literally dying out. What you all do is so important. I mean, Winthrop has seen good days and bad days, and this group should stay here all the time because the history of this place is unique. Their service to this country, their service to this state, their service to this town, men and women together, that keeps Winthrop moving into the 22nd, 23rd century, hopefully. And you never know where the history's going to be. It's right there in your backyard. All right, so, anybody else any questions? Things you want to throw at me? Janet's getting into her purse. Janet, don't throw anything at Janet.
I was gonna say, with the Whiting kids, we live in Jonathan Whiting's grandson's house,
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
so,
Where's that?
on 41.
That's
right
what I just
near
showed you,
the
Jeff.
Oh,
Reedfield
okay.
border,
Okay.
right there.
This is Karen.
There.
Yeah,
Isn't that neat?
he married Sarah Whiting, and his brother married Mary Whiting, so the brothers married sisters.
Okay.
That happens a lot too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think some of them are in, I know all the Stevens are there, and there's a cemetery in Reedfield, that is Stevens Cemetery, but I think there's Whitings in there too when I went
I'm
poking
surprised.
around in there.
Sometimes they marry two brothers marry two sisters, and sometimes one of the sisters dies, and they marry the other one. They marry the other sister,
Right.
which has got to make for really weird family reunions and Christmas
Yeah.
celebrations, right? That's the joke about the family tree. Sometimes a wreath.
Auburn was a twin, Mary Whiting, Sarah Whiting's twin was Joanna.
So I can find that picture of Jonathan Whiting, the third one.
So he had twin girls.
Oh, here it is.
Twin girls had a lot
This is
of
not a happy guy.
twins.
Looks kind of angry. Like, taking my picture. But you know what? I kind of try to imagine them. Maybe the first Jonathan Whiting looked a little bit like this. When I saw a picture of my mother, I go, "Oh, that's what I look like." She looked like her. And then I think there's here's Mabel and Edwin Whiting. Let's get down the path a little bit. Her maiden name is Robbins.
Yeah.
A good friend of mine from college is married to a Robbins from New Hampshire, Maine, and so
The Robins are on the Narrows Pond Road.
yeah. And there's a Robbins place up in Bar Harbor. There's a hotel, Robbins Hotel. And so again, like I said, in 1690, in the height of the witch trials, you could have fit everyone in New England inside Fenway Park. And there's what, 37,000 people? That's not a lot of people.
No, they're all related.
So I try to imagine, and it's hard to do in Boston because you get to Boston and things are so modern and changed, but where the Haymarket Station is where Amy's grandfather's house used to be. But what's funny about it is you can go on a map, and someone's made a map, and there's like 30 people in downtown Boston. And he was the minister, so he had a special plot of land. You all know where the Globe Corner bookstore is in Boston? It's now Chipotle, which is really sad. But it's the old, where Hawthorne used to hang out and Emerson used to have coffee there. Across the way, that's where Anne Hutchinson's house used to stand. And across the way was Governor Winthrop's house. And his house was on what is now Spring Street. And it's called Spring Street because the best source of water was a spring that ran right through that part of Boston. And of course the governor gets to have that land. And part of what caused this problem with Anne Hutchinson was he could see people. She was allowed to preach. It's that in some ways she shouldn't have been that successful. And he's like, wait a second, I just saw my friend Steve. What's going on? Amy's other grandfather was Danforth. You know the Danforth name in Maine?
Yeah.
Danforth, Maine. John Danforth was the first president of Maine in that sense back in the day when it was still part of Massachusetts. First treasurer of Harvard College. The town's named after him. His brother was a minister in Roxbury, and his house was across the street from a local pub. And he would sit in his office and write a sermon, and he'd watch people come out of the pub that he knew, and he'd go over there and yell at them. How dare thou be drinking? Reverend Danforth, I'm sorry. But this is the beauty of this stuff. These people existed, they're flesh and bones, whether they're famous or not. There are stories. And it's important for our kids to remember these stories and encourage them to research and go, these books are horrible, I know, but if you're in a seminary, wait, I think there are members, there might be Copperthwaites in it, let's go look. Just take an extra hour, you'll be amazed. My dad used to make us go, my family's been in the power pole business for 100 years. We had to check out power pole wherever we were. Does it say bell pole? Oh, yes it does, Dad. Yay! Amy's dad was a water engineer. They had to look at all the dams. So, find your hook and get those kids into it. Because you know what? Jonathan may sit around and complain about it and act like this is the most boring thing in the world, but I know he loves it. He does remember it. So, he's the one that said we should get Gary Crocker to get a wreath for Wreaths Across America and put it on the grave in the cemetery. So, he's paying attention. He may act like he doesn't pay attention when he called him and said, Dad, I forgot my cleats for the baseball game. Really, dude? You get one shot at that. After this, you don't bring your cleats, you don't play game. What? It's called responsibility. Kids are like that, though. So I appreciate you all coming out and listening. We get to talk. If you know Ungers from that part of the world, that's awesome. Again, there's another example of what really a small world it is and how we're all connected even more so now that we can go on the internet. And thank God for people that have done all that work for us.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sites is a place called Famous Kin. You can go through and put your family name in, and it's start telling you. So it turns out Amy's family is related to the Washburns, another huge name in Maine.
Yeah.
Jonathan's a huge fan of Seth MacFarlane, distant cousin. You're really cousin Seth? Well, I don't think I should get you in the door. But we're all related at some point. There's a genealogical program being done. There's a guy who wrote a book, a guy named A.J. Jacobs. He's written wonderful books about it. He did a whole thing called Living the Bible in 1 year. He went through all the stuff in the Old Testament, how they lived, and tried to live that way.
Yeah.
So he had Hebrew clothing and the beard back the patriarchs used to have. He wrote a book about relations and all this genealogical stuff. Someone's trying to figure out, I think, how many generations back we're all related
Yeah.
at some point. No, we're not. Yes, we are. But they're trying to put this database together. And it's a little scary that someone has that much power and that much information. I hope it's not Elon Musk. You never know. So just take your kids out, your grandkids out, and show them around and talk to them because it's important. All right. Thank you very much.
Janet, thanks for coming.
Bye, Janet. Thanks for stopping by.
I'll be in touch.
All right. She does such a wonderful job at the senior college with people. You'd figure most people would already know how to do all the writing, but she's showing them a whole other way of looking at things. So, yep. So.
Well, thank you, Mike, very
Oh,
much.
no, thank you. Thank you.